I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. As of today, Quebecers need to show proof of vaccination to enter liquor and cannabis stores. And the vaccine passport is being extended to big box stores next week. This comes after Quebec Premier François Legault announced that he plans to tax unvaccinated Quebecers if they refuse to get at least one dose of vaccine in the next few weeks, unless they have a medical condition associated with getting vaccinated. However, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation says Canadians don't need another tax to burden them during the pandemic. Well, joining us now to tell us more about their stance on taxing the unvaccinated is Mr. Franco Terrazano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Now, the CTF isn't the only major organization speaking out against this. Today, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh just spoke about these taxes. He's against them as well. So what do we know so far about the Quebec government's proposed tax on the unvaccinated?
We don't have a lot of details. It seems like taxpayers may be paying it through their provincial tax filing. We don't know how much it would cost. It still seems a little half-baked. But here's what we do know. It would be a slippery slope. It would open up the floodgates to a raft of new types of taxes. And also, we're not going to tax our way out of a pandemic. And that's why you have some politicians and bureaucrats, they're trying to target Canadians. They're trying to divide Canadians, I should say. But that's why we're saying all Canadians, whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, you have to unite against this new tax.
Now, on the other hand, Premier Legault claims that this is a health contribution from the unvaccinated. So considering that the unvaccinated are more likely to need medical care, do you think this is a fair ask?
Well, this is not a health contribution. This is a new tax. I think we have to make that clear. And what the pandemic has really done, it put a spotlight on some of the issues in our government healthcare system that were going on even before COVID-19. So Canadians before the pandemic were paying more than many of our industrialized peers for healthcare, but we weren't getting the best results. We weren't getting the best results on things like acute care beds per capita or doctors per capita. There were capacity issues before the pandemic. Now, fast forward to today. The federal government has spent more than $500 billion on the pandemic. You have provincial healthcare budgets in total, nearly $400 billion since 2020. So I think that leaves us with two crucial questions. First is, well, how many hundreds of billions of dollars do taxpayers need to fork over before our healthcare system is not on the brink of collapse? And second, well, when are these politicians and bureaucrats who haven't missed a paycheck, who are getting six-figure taxpayer-funded salaries, when are they going to be held accountable for their failure to come up with better solutions?
And it's interesting that the CTF is calling on all Canadians, vaccinated and unvaccinated, to unite and speak out against this tax. Why should all Canadians care about this?
Particularly if you're vaccinated, you should stand up against this. Some politicians, they want the unvaccinated to pay more today, but who are they going to come after tomorrow? We have to remember that there's a lot of actions that we take in our day-to-day lives that could put us in the hospital. And here's some examples. If you put a little bit too much butter on your popcorn, are you going to have to send the government a check? If you're like me and you ate way too much over the holidays, put on a bit too much weight, are you going to get a tax bill for that? But what about your kids or your grandkids? If they fall off their bike trying a new jump, is a tax bill going to come with stitches? So really, we see this as a very slippery slope, and that's why all Canadian taxpayers need to unite against this new tax.
So considering that this is a pandemic-related tax, sir, how much extra or new taxes have Canadians already paid during the pandemic itself?
Well, Canadians are already overtaxed. Just think about all the taxes that we have to pay. You got income taxes, business taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, import taxes, carbon taxes, you name it, taxpayers pay it. And even in the pandemic, the average family's budget, 36% of it goes to taxes. And that's more than what the average Canadian family pays on the necessities like food, shelter, and clothing combined.
All right, sir, just about a minute left here. So how can Canadians hold their politicians and bureaucrats accountable as the CTF is calling for them to do?
Well, I think you have to call your politicians, specifically your premier, and tell them that you will not tolerate any new type of tax. And what's so concerning is that this is following a trend from some of our governments here, where their only solution, so-called, it seems like, is to hammer Canadians with a higher tax bill, right? Some politicians want Canadians to drive fewer trucks, so they hammer us with a carbon tax. When carbon taxes don't work, they hammer us with higher carbon tax. To address housing prices, you have these bureaucrats funding reports to hit us with a new home tax. So this is following a very clear but disturbing trend.
Some food for thought there, sir. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Next, an interview with Dr. Abhishek Raut about Pfizer's COVID-19 pill treatment. As COVID-19 related hospitalizations continue their steady climb across the country, there is hope that Health Canada's approval Monday of Pfizer's antiviral COVID pill will help ease the health system strain. But health officials stress that it's not a replacement for vaccinations. Meanwhile, Canada's top doctor says the latest evidence does not show the Omicron variant is contagious for any less time than previous versions of the coronavirus. Chief Public Health Officer Dr. Teresa Tam says the sheer number of infections from Omicron is stressing workforces and has led every province and territory to follow American guidance and end isolation periods early. On Tuesday, Dr. Tam told MPs that the pandemic may end with an endemic form of the virus. Well, joining us now to tell us more about these latest developments is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Always a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with Pfizer's new COVID-19 pill, Paxlevid. What do we know so far about it, Doctor?
Well, Paxlevid really contains two medicines, the nirmatrelvir and the ritonavir, both antivirals. Nirmatrelvir is a protease inhibitor, which means it works by blocking the viral replication in the early stages of the disease to really prevent progression to severe COVID-19. Ritonavir is really given with nirmatrelvir as a booster in many ways to help slow that metabolism and keep it in the body for longer periods of time with higher concentrations to combat the virus. So the medication is typically taken twice a day for 5 days. And some trials have shown that Paxlevid actually reduces the risk of hospitalization and death by 89% when medications are started within 3 days, beginning of symptoms, and up to 85% if started within 5 days.
Sounds very promising, Dr. Raut. So how does this pill compare to getting vaccinated when it comes to your immune response?
All right. So when we look at Pfizer specifically, the vaccine had a 91.3% efficacy against symptomatic COVID-19 infection. It was also found to be about 89% effective in preventing severe disease. Now, these numbers were relevant before Omicron, and what we understand is 2 shots may just not be enough with Omicron. So for Omicron, what we do know is a more robust protection is achieved by a 3rd dose. The booster gives you an antibody titer about 25-fold. And the third dose does provide a similar level of neutralizing antibodies to Omicron, as we saw those numbers from even before.
So what does this new pill mean for our continued fight against the virus?
I think it's an excellent addition to our arsenal against COVID-19. We do know that there are going to be issues. Dr. Teresa Tam has discussed that the supply of Paxlevid will be an early issue for sure, meaning likely the treatment is not going to be having much of an impact in the current Omicron wave. Canada has received about 30,000 courses already and 120,000 coming through after March.
Now, talking about Dr. Teresa Tam, she mentioned that Omicron is infectious for up to 10 days. So what does that mean for provinces that have shorter isolation requirements?
That's right. So very confusing area for sure. 3 weeks ago, the Center for Disease Control in the States cut down their period from 10 to 5. And it was based on a lot of evidence supporting that the infectious period may have been about 3 to 4 days. Public Health Agency of Canada still recommends that we go for 10 days, even after they test positive or symptoms begin. And there is evidence to support that as well. Unfortunately, every province and territory has stopped following that advice, starting with Ontario and Saskatchewan. Most provinces actually have reduced to 7 days, and a few others have reduced to 5 days there. So in Canada, those rules are set by the provinces and territories. And so really the provincial governments have the final say in isolation rates.
All right, Doctor, just about a minute left here, but Dr. Tam also said on Tuesday that the pandemic may end with an endemic form of the virus. So that sounds very interesting. What would an endemic form of the virus look like?
Right. So it certainly would look it would look complicated. I think what we're trying to see is whether that means mild disease. And the truth is it doesn't. An endemic disease does not mean a mild disease, and a mild disease does not mean an endemic disease. For instance, malaria killed more than 600,000 people in 2020, and it's considered an endemic disease. So overall, we still have a lot to go through. And I think when we see endemic, people will live with it, but not painlessly.
All right, Doctor, a quick 30 seconds left here, but what is your recommendation for Canadians who are afraid of catching this extremely infectious Omicron variant?
Right, so it's a confusing time with a lot of conflicting advice. So we should keep to basics, hand wash as much as you can, wear a mask as much as possible, follow the local isolation protocols, and if you haven't already, get your vaccinations and boosters.
Dr. Rout, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today. This week, we spoke with Brendan Caldwell, director of Caldwell Securities Limited, about the future of tech stocks. We'll have that interview coming up after break, so stay with us. We'll be right back. Technology stocks led another decline on Wall Street Thursday, leaving the Nasdaq Composite down 2.5%. Microsoft, Nvidia, and other big tech companies had some of the biggest losses. The S&P 500 fell 1.4%, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average gave back 0.5%. Industrial stocks did relatively well, though, while Delta Airlines jumped after reporting surprisingly good results. Meanwhile, financial stocks were mixed ahead of quarterly report cards Friday from several major banks, including JP Morgan Chase, and Treasury yields mostly fell after rising sharply since the beginning of the year. Well, joining us now to talk more on the future of tech stocks in particular is Brendan Caldwell, director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Always good to be here, Nima.
Now, it seems that tech stocks are really taking a beating, Brendan. There was a large Wall Street sell-off yesterday. We mentioned there was another decline on Wall Street today. Why is all of this happening?
Well, there's a combination of factors, in very least, not the least of which is it's January. And the market in general and tech stocks in specific have been on a real run since the depth of the fear-based correction of the pandemic in the spring of 2020. They've been going straight up for the last year and a half. So if we're going to take gains in your tech stocks, you're probably going to take them in January. There are other factors as well. The future of the market and valuations and interest rates. But I think that's probably the single biggest reason is that it's January, which doesn't sound terribly scientific, but that's a big part of it.
So considering that a lot of investors have some sort of tech stocks in their portfolios, should they consider maybe selling their technology positions at this time?
I think it depends why they own them. If they were owning them for the big short-term run-up and thought they could get everything out of them, then maybe. But if they don't have a compelling investment reason, and selling them just for, say, tax reasons might not be the best move. What they could do with them, if they are so charitably inclined, is actually take them and you can make a donation of a technology stock to a charity in Canada and get a tax deduction and not have to pay any capital gains tax. So there are lots of things one can do with them. But if you're buying a tech stock, a particular company, whether it's Microsoft or Roblox, because you believe in what that company's doing and are really interested in it and think about there's a future for it, if it's a long-term hold, I wouldn't sell just because it's a short-term correction.
And there's also been a rise in interest rates recently. So do you see if there is any correlation with the sell-off and this increase in interest rates, Brendan?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question, Nima, because a lot of these tech stocks are trading at very high valuations relative to the amount of money they actually make. And the idea is that if interest rates are very low, the fact that they're not going to be making money for several years, those future earnings are not discounted by very much because interest rates are so low, the rate at which you discount future earnings is very low. But as interest rates rise, the more one discounts future earnings when one's figuring out a valuation. So higher interest rates should mean that stocks will not trade at as big a multiple to the future earnings that investors are hoping for. So long-winded way of saying yes, higher rates, probably not good for tech stocks or other stocks that are at great big valuations relative to the money they might make in the future.
And do you think that this can be compared to the tech bubble in 1999, Brendan? Would you be able to remind our viewers how that played out?
Well, that was an interesting one because that was so what happened was the late 90s, because of a relatively small, infinitesimal financial crisis compared to what we've been through since, the US Federal Reserve flooded the market with money. And what happened was that money went to buy stocks, particularly tech stocks, and the NASDAQ went all the way up to 5,000 or 5,400. Now, what you mentioned Microsoft earlier, what I feel, and I never said this on TV before, but what I feel was the trigger for the tech bubble bursting in the early 2000s was Steve Ballmer, the then CEO of Microsoft, saying that he thought Microsoft was overvalued. Almost never happens that a CEO says his own company's overvalued. And people thought, well, if Microsoft, with all that cash and all that earnings, is overvalued, what about all these, at the time, .com stocks? Flash forward 20 odd years, you've now got a lot of stocks that are trading at very high multiples, as we said earlier, based on future earnings. So I think there is an analogy, but I think the analogy might also be, look what the internet has done since the .com bubble. Look how important it's become to the economy. So too, whether it's blockchain or cryptocurrencies or the metaverse, I think the current, if it is a bubble, the current bubble stocks will have a future in whatever the next virtual or real economy comes next.
Very insightful conversation as always, Brendan. Thank you again. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is warning that the response by the U.S. and its allies will be swift and severe if Russia invades Ukraine. He appears to be clearing up any confusion after President Joe Biden was heavily criticized yesterday. It was for saying a minor incursion by Russia would elicit a lesser response. Mr. Blinken is in Berlin for a Quad meeting holding talks with diplomats from Germany, France, and Britain. Meanwhile, Russia says more than 140 warships and more than 60 aircraft will take part in drills in several parts of the world this month. That's as Moscow claims the West is plotting provocations in neighboring Ukraine, where the Kremlin has been accused of planning aggressive military action. The maneuvers involve the bulk of Russia's naval potential and will take place in the Mediterranean, northeastern Atlantic, and the Pacific Ocean. Well, people are used to giving to the Red Cross, but now the aid group finds itself affected by some who've taken from it. The International Committee of the Red Cross says hackers have broken into its servers and gotten personal, confidential information on more than 500,000 people. The hack is of great concern to the organization because the data includes info on people who have had to be separated from their families because of war, migration, or disaster. The head of the ICRC implores those involved in the hack to please not share, sell, leak, or otherwise use the data. Security screening devices made by a company with deep ties to the Chinese military and the highest ranks of the Communist Party are raising security concerns in Europe. The NICTEC devices are in use at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Europe's largest ports, airports from Amsterdam to Athens, and NATO's borders with Russia. While frozen out of the U.S., NICTEC has become the leading company by revenue for cargo and vehicle scanners. A growing number of Western security officials fear Chinese authorities could exploit NICTEC equipment. The first flights carrying fresh water and other aid to Tonga finally arrived. This was after the Pacific nation's main airport runway was cleared of ash left by a huge volcanic eruption. New Zealand and Australia each sent military transport planes that were carrying water containers, kits for temporary shelters, generators, hygiene supplies, and communications equipment. UN humanitarian officials report that more than 80% of Tonga's population have been impacted by the volcano's eruption. Homes were destroyed, drinking water was polluted by volcanic ash, and the single fiber optic cable that connects Tonga with the world was likely severed. The United Nations says food distribution in Ethiopia's blockaded Tigray region has reached its all-time lowest. This while more than 50,000 children are thought to be severely malnourished. It is the latest sign of a growing crisis amid efforts to end the country's 14-month war. Thursday's update by the UN Humanitarian Agency says food aid stocks and fuel are almost entirely exhausted in the Tigray region of some 6 million people. The government imposed the blockade in June 2021 in an attempt to stop supplies from reaching Tigray forces. The director of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says at least 2.8 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines donated to the continent's countries have expired, citing short shelf lives as the major reason. Africa CDC Director John Nkegasong told an online briefing Thursday that more than 60% of the 572 million vaccine doses delivered to the continent have already been administered. But he said that just over 10% of Africa's population of 1.3 billion people are fully vaccinated. A long-awaited report on sexual abuse in Germany's Munich diocese has faulted retired Pope Benedict XVI's handling of cases when he was archbishop in the 1970s and 1980s. The report released Thursday said there were 4 cases in which Pope Benedict, then Cardinal Josef Ratzinger, could be accused of misconduct. The law firm that drew up the report said that Pope Benedict strongly denies any wrongdoing. The report also faulted the current archbishop, a prominent ally of Pope Francis, in 2 cases. 19-year-old Zara Rutherford is going into the Guinness World Records book as the youngest woman to fly solo around the world. Her small airplane downed in western Belgium today after a 155-day journey of more than 52,000 kilometers. She wants to inspire the spirit of aviation in young women and girls worldwide and encourage them to take up studies in the exact sciences, mathematics, engineering, and technology. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. And remember, for news on demand, you could always follow us on social media. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.